Hi there, Allison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today's wine is taking us to the Livermore Valley in California, and we're looking at the Kent Winery 2021 Ghielmetti Vineyard Cabernet Franc. For those that have been following this project for some time now, you may have noticed that I have not featured many Cabernet Francs from California. While we are starting to see more and more single varietal Cabernet Francs emerging from the state, and the grape has been the subject of some positive press in recent years, the reality is that Cabernet Franc still represents a very small piece of the overall viticultural landscape across the state. As of 2023, there was about 3,485 acres of Cabernet Franc vines planted in California. That's about 1,410 hectares. And this represents less than 1% of the overall wine grape acreage in the state. And it's a drop in the bucket compared to the state's #1 planted variety, Cabernet Sauvignon, which at last count had around 95,638 acres under vine. That's about 37,000 hectares. So when I'm looking at Cabernet Franc from California, for me, commitment matters. And I found that the wines that really speak to me are from those producers that have, well, gone all in on Cabernet Franc, so to speak, that make Cabernet Franc and single varietal Cabernet Franc an important part of their DNA, rather than, say, those producers that all of a sudden out of the blue make a single varietal Cabernet Franc one vintage, or in some cases a varietally labeled Cabernet Franc that has up to 25% other varieties in it, just because it's now in vogue to do so. And this brings me to today's wine and the story of Stephen Mirassou, someone who has gone all in on Cabernet Franc. Stephen is the 6th generation in America's oldest winemaking family, whose roots in the wine business can be traced back to 1854. Stephen's winemaking journey began in 1996 when he and his father created Kent Winery in the Livermore Valley, which at the time had, and to a certain extent still does today, a strong focus on Cabernet Sauvignon. After Stephen moved back to California, he quickly discovered Kermit Lynch's retail shop in Berkeley. And many will recall that Kermit Lynch was one of the first in the US to embrace Loire Valley Cabernet Franc. And he was responsible for introducing many iconic domains to American consumers and professionals. So in the early 2000s, Stephen started to discover the joys of Loire Valley Cabernet Franc from the wines from producers like Charles Joguet, Bernard Vaudry, and others. By the 2006 vintage, Stephen decided to make his first single varietal Cabernet Franc from fruit from the Ghielmetti Vineyard in Livermore. And seeing the quality and distinctiveness of this expression of Cabernet Franc from Livermore, and noting that it offered a point of differentiation in the oceans of Cabernet Sauvignon being produced in the state, Stephen started to work a little bit more closely with his grower partners, and little by little he started to increase his focus on Cabernet Franc as part of the Kent Winery range. Fast forward now to 2017, and Stephen launches L'Autre Côte Cabernet Franc, which is his nod to the right bank of Bordeaux. And this is really the winer's flagship expression of Cabernet Franc. And today, Stephen, alongside his son Aidan and his wife Beth, they're working with around 15 acres of Cabernet Franc vines from select sites across the Livermore Valley. And to put a bow on Stephen's enthusiasm for Cabernet Franc, in 2023, they made 13 different expressions of Cabernet Franc, including a blanc de noir, so a white Cabernet Franc, or a Cabernet Franc blanc. They also made some expressions of rosé, and of course, different expressions and styles of red Cabernet Franc as well. Now, in addition to all of this, Stephen has become a champion for the variety, launching an annual celebration called Cab Franc-a-Palooza that brings together producers from across the US and beyond. And he's also writing and speaking affectionately about the variety as part of his newsletter and podcast, Wine Saves Lives. So today I decided to open the Ghielmetti Single Vineyard Cabernet Franc as a way to tell Stephen's story, because this is really the vineyard and the wine that got it started for Stephen way back in 2006. So, located in Alameda County and part of California's Central Coast region, the Livermore Valley is one of California's oldest wine growing regions. Long before Napa Valley became synonymous with world-class Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay, it was the Livermore's pioneering Concannon and Wente families that were among the first in the state to plant these varieties in their vineyards in Livermore back in the 1880s. And today, it is estimated that up to 80% of California's Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay vines can be genetically traced back to these vines that were planted by these families in Livermore. Today, in terms of the Livermore Valley, there's around 3,200 acres under vine. And to put that into perspective, that's about 7% of the cultivated area of Napa Valley. So we're dealing with a very small region. The most planted varieties, perhaps unsurprisingly, are Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay, and currently there's around 60 acres of Cabernet Franc vines planted in the Livermore Valley. Situated about 50 kilometers due east of San Francisco, and then bound by the Pleasanton and Sunol ridges in the west and the Altamont Pass in the east, the Livermore Valley is considered a coastal valley region, and it is the first coastal valley region east of San Francisco Bay. The viticultural area is an oval-shaped bowl that stretches about 40 kilometers from west to east, and it's about 18 kilometers wide, and it sits on an east-west axis, making it one of the very few east-west oriented valleys in California. In addition to this, the region actually sits up a little bit higher in elevation compared to some other coastal valley regions. It ranges from around 100 meters above sea level in the west to about 300 meters above sea level in the east. And this elevation helps to contribute to the wider diurnal range in temperatures that the region experiences during the growing season. So we have this east-west oriented valley. We have a slightly higher elevation and a gradual incline in elevation as you move from west to east, coupled with the fact that this is the first coastal valley region east of San Francisco Bay, means the Livermore Valley receives the strongest influence of the cold air and cold breezes that are coming in off of San Francisco Bay and the Pacific Ocean during the growing season, most notably in the afternoons. So this is helping to moderate temperatures, and this gives the Livermore Valley overall a little bit cooler climate than some other growing regions in Northern California. In general, because of how the wind speeds tend to pick up as you move from west to east across the valley, the western part of Livermore tends to be a little bit warmer, and then conditions get progressively cooler as you move east. Now, in terms of soils, what dominates the valley floor and lower hillside sites are deep alluvial soils that are derived from parent materials from the surrounding hillsides. We'll find gravelly loams, sandy loams, and also some clay loams, depending on where you are. And in terms of the valley as a whole, we actually tend to find more lighter textured, sandier soils in the western part of the Livermore Valley. And then as you move east, we will find more and more pockets of clay loam soils. The soils overall are rich in minerals like calcium and magnesium, and the soils are also more alkaline in pH. Also, the soils have very good drainage, which is of course excellent for viticulture. Now, imagine we have this rather large-ish region. We have quite a bit of variability from west to east and variations in elevation, and we have a wide variety of soil types and textures across the region as well. So that means that site selection is quite critical, particularly for Cabernet Franc, which is a notoriously site-sensitive grape variety. Now, in addition to all of this, there is a unique climactic phenomenon that is taking place here in the Livermore Valley as a result of climate change that may serve to benefit Cabernet Franc over the long term. And this phenomenon is wind. Grapevines are generally sensitive to wind, and they can shut down and stop photosynthesis altogether in very windy conditions. And what is happening here in the Livermore Valley during the hottest months of the year, so July through September, as the Central Valley, which is on the other side of the Altamont Pass, begins to get hotter, an increase in temperature, that is creating a vacuum-like effect that is sucking in all of this cold air from San Francisco Bay and increasing wind speeds up to around 25 to 30 kilometers per hour in the afternoons and into the early evenings before the winds die down completely at night as the Central Valley cools. So imagine the vines have stopped ripening because of these windy conditions. And that means that the vines then need more time to ripen the fruit into the fall. So these winds are effectively slowing down ripening and lengthening the growing season. So when it comes time for harvest, which is generally 2 to 4 weeks behind Napa Valley, they are able to pick fruit that is physiologically ripe, but at lower sugars and potential alcohol levels. So with climate change and as the Central Valley keeps getting hotter and hotter, the Livermore Valley is getting progressively cooler and this growing season is lengthening. And it is very conceivable that in the future, there may not be enough time to fully ripen Cabernet Sauvignon. And as a result, Cabernet Franc, which ripens around 10 to 14 days earlier than Cabernet Sauvignon, may become the future of the Livermore Valley. In fact, Stephen shared with me that since he's been making wine in Livermore, he's routinely picking Cabernet Franc towards the end of October and Cabernet Sauvignon in the middle of November. And this is on average 2 weeks later than what it was just 15 years ago. Now, looking a little bit more closely at the Ghielmetti Vineyard, this is a 64-acre vineyard, and it's located in the southeast corner of the Livermore Valley, about 5 miles due east of downtown Livermore. And it is in probably one of the most easterly sites in the region, and it sits on a west-facing slope, a gentle slope, and it's rising in elevation from about 260 meters above sea level in the western part of the vineyard to about 290 meters above sea level in the eastern part of the vineyard. And because of this very easterly position, just before we hit that Altamont Pass, those winds that I spoke about tend to be at their maximum impact right here, right around the Ghielmetti Vineyard. Now, the vineyard as a whole, in terms of varieties, there are a number of different varieties planted here. And Cabernet Franc, there's about 3.7 acres of Cabernet Franc planted here. The vines were planted in 99 and it's planted with clone 332, and that's a clone from the Pyrenees. And then in terms of soil, we do have a variety of soils across this 64-acre vineyard. What's in the Cabernet Franc block is fine pacitous gravelly loam that is derived from sandstone and shale. And the topsoil has a balanced mix of sand, silt, and clay. And then we'll find up to about 50% clay content in the subsoil from 60 to 100 centimeters. This vineyard is actually considered one of the winery's estate vineyards that Stephen manages himself and has managed personally since 2005. The vineyard is farmed sustainably and drip irrigation is installed. And in terms of viticultural practices, this vineyard, they do perform shoot thinning throughout. Selective leaf removal will happen as well on the western side of the canopy to increase sun exposure. And then they will do green harvesting at about 60% of a raisin. You should note as well, Stephen shared with me that this Ghielmetti Vineyard is one of the coolest and windiest sites in the region, and it is typically the last one to bud in the spring and the last to be harvested in the fall as well. Now, looking at the winemaking for this wine, the fruit is all hand harvested, and it's harvested around 3 to 4 o'clock in the morning to ensure the fruit is coming into the winery nice and cool. And then in terms of the fermentation, this takes place in a smaller 1.7 ton open top fermenters with selected yeast. And the target maximum fermentation temperature is around 27 degrees Celsius. They'll do some punch downs during the fermentation in order to aid extraction. The total time on skins is about 28 days. And then in terms of after the post-fermentation maceration, they will blend the free-run wine and press wine before aging. And aging takes place in predominantly 500-liter neutral French oak puncheons. And the total aging is about 14 to 18 months. So let's dive in. So one thing that immediately strikes me about this wine is the fragrance. It is very lifted and very perfumed, really kind of leaps out of the glass. There's a real fineness to the perfume as well. In terms of the fruit profile, actually I would say that this wine leans a little bit more on the savory side. But there is a nice underlying fruit profile. So I'm getting mostly red fruits here. Like a mix of sweet, plush red fruits like cherry, a bit of strawberry. There's a little bit of like a nice plum note here as well. But yeah, the fruits are a little bit more on the fleshier side. There is a certain ripeness to the fruit that maybe suggests that we are somewhere a little bit sunnier perhaps. And then in terms of the herbal profile, it's really lovely. And as I said, I think the herbals come through a little bit more than the fruit, which I totally dig. And they're beautifully in balance. So it's a nice mix of, say, mint. There's a little bit of like a dried bay leaf here. Touch of almost eucalyptus in a way, like a very delicate eucalyptus note. Like I kind of think dry Mediterranean climate shrubbery. And then there's some nice floral notes on the nose as well. And then on top of that, we keep going here, there's a nice spiciness to the nose. And it is varietal spice that's coming through on the nose. That for me is like Hungarian paprika. There's even a little bit of like a white peppercorn thing going on as well. In terms of the fruit profile, it continues and is very consistent on the palate. If anything, it might lean just a hair more tart, like sweet tart fruits, like a little bit of a raspberry or even like a sour cherry thing happening on the palate, which is really nice because that's providing this nice little counterpoint to that riper nose or profile on the nose. Those savory undertones come through in a really nice way. It's actually a little bit more floral as well on the palate, which I'm really quite liking. The spiciness punches through in a really awesome way on the palate. This is a spicy Cabernet Franc, which I really like. And the spice profile on the palate, there's a nice mix of varietal spice as well as a bit of like oak spice here. So there's some classic things like, like clove, a little bit of allspice, nutmeg, stuff like that. But then you get that Hungarian paprika, there's a bit of that white pepper, a little bit of pink peppercorn going on as well. It's really nice. There's also some kind of other layers here, which I can't quite put my finger on, but there is some nice layers to the profile. There's quite a lot of complexity here. The acidity is great. It is lively. It's very invigorating. And there is a certain kind of continuum of acidity and this continuous nature of the acidity in that it kind of is present like right from the beginning as soon as the wine hits your palate, but it continues and is very persistent through the whole palate experience. And I really love how that acidity is just kind of waking me up in a way. It's really quite lovely. The tannins are excellent, beautifully managed tannins, kind of silky in texture, beautifully fine. There's a nice uniformity to the tannins as well, which I sometimes talk about, is that kind of nice kind of grid-like pattern, and I am seeing a nice degree of uniformity with the tannins, and they do have a little bit of a nice chalkiness on the finish too. The wine is medium-bodied. There's a nice juiciness factor to the palate experience as well, which is lovely. It's providing this wonderful buoyancy and kind of almost playfulness about this wine, which I think is kind of interesting because there's some nice structure here. Like you do sense that there is a serious edge to the wine, but this beautiful sucrosity of fruit and just integrity of the fruit that continues through the palate, and that fineness of the tannins and the beautifully managed tannins gives this wine this wonderful, like I said, it's kind of juicy. It has this sort of playful edge to it as well, which is really quite lovely. Yeah, I would would say that this Cabernet Franc leans a little bit more on the leaner side in terms of that profile. It's very focused. It's kind of stealthy in a way, and it's very sophisticated. Yeah, that's a good way of describing it. There is a wonderful degree of sophistication and poise to this wine that is really pretty, and it feels like a little bit of a departure than some other California Cabernet Francs that I've tried that tend to lean a little bit more on the big, riper side of the spectrum. And this just feels beautifully restrained, great elegance, great finesse. It's just lovely. It's a really delicious Cabernet Franc. And like I said, it kind of balances that seriousness. It's also approachable at the same time. And what really comes through for me is there's this wonderful sense of purpose and intention. Like it feels like a really thoughtful wine, a wine that was really well thought through as well. And I think that speaks to Stephen in terms of how he thinks about Cabernet Franc and his journey with Cabernet Franc. And I have to say, I've been fortunate. Stephen sent me this wine and his two other Cabernet Francs from the 2021 vintage. And this was my first time trying the wines, and I'm super impressed. I think he's on the right track. I'm excited to follow this project and hopefully get to California at some point to taste his 13 Cabernet Francs from 2023, because you can see that he loves the variety, and he's going, as I said at the beginning of this video, all in with Cabernet Franc, because it's evident, I think, in the glass. And while the production of this wine is really small, I think if I recall, it was like 50 cases or something like this. It's very tiny. And it's actually will be a wine club release specifically. I wanted to show this wine, and I wanted to use this as my kind of launch point to talk about Stephen and his work with Cabernet Franc, because for me, this is kind of, like I said at the beginning, it's really the one that kind of got it started all for Stephen and his winemaking journey. So if by chance you do not have the opportunity to taste this wine specifically, I would encourage you to head to Stephen's website and have a look at his whole offering, but the L'Autre Côte white label, black label, and then of course there will be, I know, a white Cabernet Franc coming soon, as well as rosé. So this is definitely a winery to watch in California if you love Cabernet Franc. And if you've had the pleasure of trying Stephen's Cabernet Francs, do let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. Or perhaps if you know another winery in the Livermore Valley that is focusing on Cabernet Franc, I would love to know who that is in the comments below. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.